Hi, in this tutorial we're gonna build a carousel using React and only React. We will learn how to process touch swipes and mouse drags in addition to clicks and key presses without using any other library. We will write handlers, do some styling and animation, as well as consider boundary conditions while we work. Let's get started. To start with creating my component, I'll do it in a blank project. Of course, you can add it in an existing project, but I'll do it in a clean project and I'll open my terminal. You can also open Windows terminal if you're using Windows. I will use Create React App to do my project, but of course, you can set up your project in any other way, in any way that you prefer. You can use Create React App, you can configure package.json and webpack and use Babel yourself, but I'll go with the easy way to create a blank project. So create React App, and let's call this project Carousel tutorial. Let's wait a bit for it to download what it needs, and then we'll start with our work. And by now our process is done. We can see that it created the folder and it's saying here that the project is there and we can start. So of course, when we create this project, we should make sure that we're using the intended directory, and here I created it in a directory called YT projects. So make sure you're using the correct directory where you want to create your project. Navigate to it in the terminal if your operating system doesn't support right-clicking and opening in terminal. Now let's open it with VS Code, or you can open it with your preferred editor. And here we are. We have a source folder, and we'll create in it a components folder. We're gonna keep the app CSS, app.js. We don't need the testing. We also don't need the logo, so I'm gonna remove these. This requires some corrections, so here we need to delete report web vitals in index.js, and here in app.js we need to remove this logo. I'm gonna erase these. I'm gonna replace them with a P that says starter, and let's run our app. I'll open a terminal in VS Code, and it opens in the projects directory, npm start, and here we have this React app. We need to delete something related to report web vitals in index.js. So back to index.js, we need to remove this line, and we're good to go from here. After obtaining this, after getting our starter, let's go ahead and create our component, our carousel component, and for that I'll create a folder in components. I'll call it carousel, and inside it I'll create carousel.js, and let's make it a functional component. I'll import React from React, though in new versions of React we don't really need to do this. And then I'll create a function called carousel, which will take some props. And at the end of this carousel, I will export default carousel. So we're creating our component, our carousel component, and we need to return. And of course, we won't return everything at the beginning. We'll just return a div that says carousel component, and then I'll go here to app.js, and I even don't need all of these. I'll just keep a div, and inside that div I will add the carousel component. Let's see what we get. We're getting the carousel component, so we're on the right track. I now want to start setting up my carousel, start seeing things other than text, and for that I'll need some CSS as well. So I'll create a new file in the carousel folder. I'll call it carousel.module.css, and if we're using new versions of React, we can use module.css and import it directly in our JS file. If you created things manually, perhaps using Webpack, you might need to keep the extension CSS or module.css depending on your configuration. So that's my CSS file. It's empty for now, but I'll start taking things from it. And here at the top of my file, of my JS file, I will import classes from carousel.module.css. So whatever I write in the carousel.module.css file, I'll get it. I'll be able to use it in the carousel.js file using classes and the class name. Let's go back to working with our carousel, and we'll have this wrapper div. Inside it, I'll have a div that will contain my carousel, my basic carousel without the indicators, and I'll call it container. So class name equals classes.container, and this will contain my left arrow, my display, and my right arrow. Therefore, I'll have a div with class name equal to classes.left arrow, and this one should be capital C since I use capital letters for my classes. Okay, so that's my div for my left arrow, and for the left arrow I'll need to either put an image of a left arrow or put some character, and I'm gonna put a character here. So I'll search for left arrow symbols, and I'll go to this uniquecode-table.com, go to left arrows, and I'll select this one. I'll copy this one and paste it here. So that's my left arrow, and then I'll have another div with the class name that's classes.displayFrame. So I'll have my arrow, my frame, and then another arrow, my right arrow, and at the end I will have classes.right arrow and its div. And for that, in the same site, I'll go to right arrows and choose this one, U+2771. Let's save and see what we have. We have these two arrows, and of course we can't see the container, and we'll start somehow to format them, format in the CSS thing, and I'll start writing my classes. Let's start with the display frame. So I'll have my class, which is display frame, and let's put these next to each other. I will start by disabling the touch action because I don't want some unexpected behavior. I will disable the touch action, and we'll do other measures because these vary between different browsers. I tried different setups and I had to do different configurations to stay on the safe side. I'll also start with defining the width. I want the width of this frame to be 95% of the view width, so of the viewport width. So therefore I'll use width 95 VW, and I want to maintain a 16:9 aspect ratio even if I resize my window. So I'll use the calc here and I'll take 95 VW and multiply it by the ratio, which translates to 0.5625. Again, 9/16 is this ratio, just in case you're wondering where this came from. I'll also don't want the height of my frame to exceed 90 VH, so max height is 90 VH, and we're seeing the arrows moving as I type these. And I also want my width to maintain the 16:9 aspect ratio when I reach the max height, and therefore I'll use max width and calculate 90 VH times 1.78. And again, let's open the calculator just to see 16/9 is 1.78. I'll set a background color just so we can see it as we proceed, and I want a grayish background. So that's my background. We can see things here. And now I can set other things. For example, my margin, I'll set it to auto. Text align will be center. I also don't want scrolling, and I don't want also to display a scroll bar. So I'll use overflow Y to be hidden and overflow X to be auto. I'll proceed with white space and set it to no wrap. I'll set the Z index to 1 because I want to maintain some layers here. I'll use different Z indices afterward. I'll also use a caret color, which is transparent. And speaking of scrolling, I don't want the scroll bar to appear as I work. This might vary between browsers, but I'll use WebKit-scrollbar and set its display to none. I also want to give this frame some curvature at the corners. I'll therefore set a border radius of 10 pixels, and we can see that its shape changed. It gained some radius, some curvature here around the corners. Let's move to the arrows. I'll start with the left arrow, so that left arrow, and I'll give it a position of absolute. I'll also offset it from the left by 1%. I'll add some padding to it. So padding left and padding right, I'll make them 2 pixels. And we can see it here. So its position from the left will be 1%. It won't be stuck to the extremity. We'll see what the effect is when we start to resize the window. When these take their places and we start to resize the window, it will change according to the width of the page. Let's continue and give it a font size of XX large. I'll also give it a color, a gray color, and since this is an ASCII character, actually this is text here, when the user selects it, it might start blinking, and I don't want that. I don't want to see a blinking cursor. So I'll set user select to none, and in case it overlapped with my display frame, I want it to appear on top of it, just as I see it now. It's overlapping with my display frame, and I want it on top, so I'll give it a z index of 2. Just to ensure that. Now when I hover over this arrow, I want a slight change in color, so I'll add left arrow hover, and I'll give it a color of BBCCDD, which is supposedly lighter, and you can see it changing colors when I hover over it. And when I click it, I want it to take a bluish color, so I'll use left arrow active and give it a bluish color, 206 EBD, and when I click it, we can see it's taking this bluish color. Now I'll do the same for the right arrow. It's the same as the left arrow, except for the right, which is 1% instead of left being 1%, and we can see it jump to this part of the screen. Instead of left, then I have right 1%, and the other things are almost the same. Actually, they are exactly the same. I'll also add the hover and active colors as before. Now I have a left arrow, I have a right arrow, and I have my display frame, but I want the arrows to be somehow at the same level with each other, and therefore I need to change the formatting of my container, which contains these. So we formatted the left arrow, the display frame, and the right arrow. Now let's move to formatting the container. So let's have this class, which is container, and I'll give it a position of relative. Display, it's a flex. Vertical align in the middle. Overflow should be hidden here as well. I'll give it a width of 100%. And I will align items at the center. And here we have a neat thing. We have the arrows and we have our display frame with it. I'll just see how this fits with some surroundings. So I will add an H5 here, call it Carousel, and I'll give it a style of text align center. So we left the previous part with a carousel that's resizable, and it won't exceed 90 VH nor 95 VW, and it would maintain the 16:9 aspect ratio. Now I want my carousel to start displaying pictures, images, and it can display other HTML elements. Why not? So we'll design that with these elements in mind. So I've selected some pictures here, which I'll put in my carousel, and therefore I will have an image with source equal to, I'll copy the link, the image address of this. I won't add an alt text because these images are generic for now. Maybe if it wasn't in a tutorial, I would add some alt text. This is another image, and I'll copy its address, and again I have image with this as the source. I'll also add an h1 element because we can do that, and I'll give it some style. I did a small mistake here, so this is sample h1, and I also have this image, and this one isn't a widescreen image, so I can try my carousel with different aspect ratios. My intention here is to style the carousel such that if an image is 16:9 or wider, it will display in this frame 16:9, it will fill it. Otherwise, if it's not 16:9, if it's less wide than 16:9, I don't want to expand it to fill this. Instead, I leave the edges with this gray background. So I'll display the image in the middle and leave the edges with this background. After adding some HTML elements for testing, images and headers and so on, we're ready to move on, and we're ready to display these images inside the display frame. So I'm gonna be working here. Of course, these images are just sample images. You can use any image you like. I want to display these images, these children, and for that I'm gonna take the children from the props. So I'm gonna use props.children. However, I'll do some destructuring, so I'll use const children equals props instead of using props.children every time. And my first intention would be to map them. Since I'll have an array, I'll receive more than one child, I can use children.map. Yet, if I receive one element, if this carousel had one image in it, this will cause an error. Because if I have one child, JavaScript won't see it as an array, and therefore I can't use map. So using children.map right away comes at a penalty. We need to handle this edge case. We can do that, we can handle this edge case, or instead we will use the children from React. The documentation for React.children is found here if you want to dive more into it, and it allows us to deal with this props.children or props.children, and it will handle the edge case for me. I can do all the work here, do the logic here, but instead I'll just put display items here and declare these items outside of the return. So I'll have const display items, and I will use the children.map with the capital C here, and I'm taking the children from the props and I'm mapping them to child and index. I could have done without the index, but I'll do things the old-fashioned way where every child will have its key, and I'm gonna give each child a unique ID, and therefore I'm gonna use the index. I'm not gonna use the ID right away, but afterward when I navigate to slides directly, I might use it. So therefore here I'll declare a div, and I'll display this child inside it. And then this div name will take a class name, which is classes.carousel item. Again, I'm using modules here. And of course, I can use CSS right away. And if I'm limited to this component only, I won't have conflicts, but I might use this in a project, in a bigger project, and therefore I won't be doing that right now. I'm also gonna give the ID, as I said, and this ID will be carousel item, and I'm gonna add the index right next to it. So this one will be carousel item 0, and this one will be carousel item 1, and this is carousel item 2, and so on. Of course, I'm not gonna keep these in my code, just so we can see what's happening. And these are my display items. These are my children that were mapped, and they're being displayed here. Going to my carousel, I can see that I have an image here, but of course it's not navigatable right now. I don't see the full image. Maybe if I zoom out, I can see that the images are stacked on top of each other, each one in its original resolution. The H1 is extending here between them, and this image is a small one because it's a low-res one. So we need some formatting, we need some CSS styling, and therefore let's move to our CSS file. Again, we're using here the carousel item class. So I'm gonna use carousel item. I'm gonna handle the swipes myself. I don't want things to get out of control. So I'm gonna set the touch action to none. I'm also gonna set the height of 100%. Let's split our view. I'm gonna set the width of 100% for my image or element, whatever that element is. And I'm gonna display inline block. I'm gonna, after doing that, align things to the top. So I want my thing to start from the top. And I might add things later on, things that are related to the animation or to how the images are stacked above each other or next to each other. And then that works if I don't have images, I guess. If we take a look here and we disable these two images, that's sample H1. It's as I intended it to be. Yet images need some special care. So I'm gonna select images in carousel item and give these images a height of 100% and a max width of 100%. So my image would fill the height of the carousel if it's less wide than the carousel, or exactly at that aspect ratio, it would fill its height. Otherwise, if it's wider, it won't go more than the width, than the carousel's width. And let's give a background color of none to the image. If we experiment with what we have, if we go to app.js, of course, these are not meant to be disabled, but I'm disabling them for now since I can't navigate in my image. So if I disable these, this is an image which is less wide and I can see the padding here. In the previous part, we worked on displaying the children of the carousel and laying them out next to each other. Now we will work on navigating between them. To do that, we need some handlers that would handle moving to the next slide and to the previous slide. And then I will connect these handlers to the buttons. We'll start with navigating with the buttons. This way the core of our project will be done, and we can move to other types of navigation. To navigate slides, I want to know at which slide I am. So I want to know I'm at the third slide. If I click on next, I should go to the fourth. If I click on previous, I should go to the second. Therefore, I need to use useState here. I'll use useState and I'll import that from React. So import useState from React, and I will call my state slider position, and I will also use set slider position for useState. Therefore, I know now I'll be able to know where I am at which slide. And I'm gonna start with slide 0 initially. So that's the first slide, the first child that I have. Let's move to writing the handlers then. For that, I'll have one called previous slide handler or prev slide handler. And I'll have another one called next slide handler. And I'll write them so that they mirror each other. Now, I'm gonna take the slider position and memorize it in new position. So let new position equal slider position. And if that position is greater than 0, I will decrease it. So new position equals new position minus 1. I'm writing some code the longer way just so that it's clearer for someone who wants to get the logic. So I move to a new position here, and I will do the same for my next slide handler. So in the next slide handler, let new position equals slider position. And if my new position is not the last one, so it's not the last child, which is children.length minus 1, I would increase it. Therefore, new position equals new position plus 1. And I would translate to that new position. So I will have another function. Therefore, I will use a function called translate full slides. So I will be transferring to a new slide here called new position. And that I will have another function later on called translate partial slides, because I might be swiping and I don't want to move to a completely new slide. So I'll move to that new position using translate full slides, and that new position would be my new state, and therefore I would set slider position to new position. And the same is mirrored here. Now that I did the handlers that would take me to new slides, I want to write a method that would take me to that slide. So I'm going to use translate full slides, which would take the new position. And here I'd let to translate. Here I have the slides or the images stitched next to each other. They're like a film, and I'm moving it so that part of it is visible in the viewport, in the div which I called display frame. If I take a look at how my slides or images are stitched next to each other, I have 0 stitched next to 1, next to 2, next to 3, and therefore there's this width span between them. And this width span is the distance between the beginning of every element. So I can therefore set to translate to be equal to minus width span times new position. I'm going to define width span here at the top of my document, and it's 100. It's basically 100% between the two. Now that I know my width span and my new position, it's the direction I'm going in the other direction, and therefore I have this negative. My image, in fact, would be moving from right to left when I go to the next slide. I have a typo here. So now I'm gonna move all of my elements. As I said, we have like a film or some stitched slides next to each other. I'm gonna move all of them so that the part that I want would be visible in my display frame. I'll use a for loop then, and I'll go from I equals 0, I is less than children dot length, I plus plus. I'm gonna take the element, each element, so let element equals document dot get element by ID, and I'm gonna call it, I'm gonna get, in fact, carousel item plus I, so I'm gonna get carousel 0, then carousel 1, so on. And I'm gonna transform this element, so element.style.transform, and the transform that I'm gonna apply is a translate x. I'm translating over the x-axis, and I'm gonna add to it the to translate, which is what I just calculated, and this is in percentage. So I'll have percent here. So I'm taking all of my elements and I'm moving them, I'm translating them. I still need to get my buttons to work at this point. So I'll go to the left arrow, to my left arrow, and I'll use onClick, and onClick I will use the previous slide handler, and for this one I'm gonna use the next slide handler. Going to my React app, I can see that they are moving, but it's somehow moving all of a sudden. It's not smooth, so I'll modify my CSS a bit. I'm gonna add to my carousel item a transition property, and I'll set it to 500 milliseconds linear. Let's see how that would perform. Okay, now the images are a bit big and they're taking some time to load, but they're doing what they're expected to. One last thing that I want to modify in this part, I'm gonna use these slide handlers, the previous slide handler and the next slide handlers, for different situations, for swipes, for clicks. So I will separate the click from other things, and therefore I won't call previous slide handler and next slide handler directly. Instead, I will use next click handler and previous click handler. So I'll replace slide with click. Again, I might also modify the click handler without touching the core function, without touching these. So I'm gonna use them here, and I'm gonna use previous click handler. For now, all it does is call previous slide handler, and the same would apply to next click handler. This still performs the same. We'll notice a small glitch when using this carousel. The slice of the previous slide is visible. We can see here a slice of the previous image is visible, and the same applies here. We can see a small slice of blue here. And I'm gonna try to solve that in CSS. I'm gonna close the images that I just downloaded, and in CSS I'm gonna add a margin to my image. So I'm gonna add a margin right to my image. Using 1% would be fine. That would be a small margin between the two, but we can go even as low as 0.1%. And we see it's not doing the trick totally yet. We're even seeing a bigger part. That's not due to the CSS though. The problem here is that I'm still translating my slide 100%, whereas I can translate it now 100.1. Since I want to account for that margin while I move between slides, and now I don't see any part of the previous slide. The same applies here. I don't see any blue from the previous slide. And I'll even try an example with two widescreen images next to each other just to verify that there's no one going to the space of the second, no one intruding the space of the second. I downloaded one more image from Wallpaper Safari, and I've added it to my images here, and it's here. And again, these two images are occupying the full width, and even if I look at them, they're not trying to intrude to the other slide. We can't see slices of them on the next slide. In my carousel, I would be able to write infinite here, and if that's there, that's either true or false. So if I write infinite, I would have my component scroll to the end and go back to the beginning. So in props, I'm gonna take infinite into consideration. And now that I have my previous slide handler and the next slide handler, it's enough to implement it there, and any form of control would take the logic from there. So here I was checking if I'm not at the first slide or last slide, whether it's in the previous slide handler or the next slide handler. Now, what if I am at that boundary condition? I'll have another if, so that's an else if. If I'm at the first slide in the previous slide handler, or I'm at the last slide in the next slide handler, I will check if infinite is there. If infinite is there, then my new position, instead of staying at its place, would be going to the last slide. So if I'm at my first slide and I click previous, I would go to the last slide, which is children.length -1. The same applies here. If I'm at my last slide, which I checked here, and infinite is there, I would go to the first slide, to slide number 0, to the 0th child. I'll save this, and I'm at the last slide now, and I click on next. I would go all the way back to the first one, and I'm at the first one. So this is the first one, and I click on previous. I would scroll to the end slide. I'll move now to working with the keyboard. I want to use my buttons to navigate between slides and between elements, children elements, my left arrow, my right arrow. I'll also add the ability to navigate with numbers. We'll come to that, but first I need to listen to my keyboard. So I'm gonna use useEffect for that purpose, and we'll make sure it's imported here. So that's useEffect. And in useEffect, I will add a listener. So window.add event listener. And I will listen to key down. and when key down is there, I will execute key press handler. And I don't want this listener to stay when this component unmounts. I want some cleanup. Therefore, I'll add a return. And in the return, in my cleanup, I would remove this. So window.remove event listener, key down, and key press handler. It makes sense, just like we handled the clicks, to handle the key press. After the previous click handler and the next click handler, I will use constant key press handler, and this will have an event. It will take an event, and we will check this event. If this event or the key in that event is arrow left, then I pressed to go to the previous slide. But this might cause some unexpected behavior. So I need to start by using event.prevent default. Otherwise, I might press the key and I might see some sliding in the slides, unexpected or undesired sliding. I also don't want this event to affect any parent component, so I will use event.stop propagation. So I don't want this click to affect anything else. And then I will execute previous slide handler. And since I have other checks afterward, I will have an if here to check if it's arrow right, and I don't want to check this because I already know it's arrow left. I will add return. Return will stop the checks and it will exit the function. Now, my second check is if event.key is arrow right. And here again, I'm gonna stop the propagation and prevent the default. So prevent default event.stop propagation. And when I press right, I wanna go to the next slide and I won't continue with the checks. There are still more checks to do, but let's test these. I have an error. I typed Windows in line 68 and it's window instead. Fixing this, we can go back to our key press handler. Let's refresh, and as I press my keyboard, I'm navigating between slides. I'm not done yet. I added the basics. I added the left, right, previous, next. Yet what if I wanna use the numbers on my keyboard? I can make use of that, but I want 1, since users start counting from 1 and not from 0. I want 1 to take me to child 0 or children 0, and I want 2 to take me to children 1, etc. And then if I press 0 and I have 10 slides, I want it to take me to children 9. So I'll add another if here, and taking a look at the ASCII table, the numbers from 1 till 9 are from 49 till 57 in decimal, and 0 is at 48. So I will check if 49 is less than or equal to event.key code and event.key code is less than or equal to 57. That means I pressed a number between 1 and 9. I will have an array pos which is equal to event.key code minus 49. So that is, if I have 49 minus 49, it would be 0. If I have 57 minus 49, it would be 8. I have the position that I want to go to, but I might not have 8 slides. So I will check if this position, if array pos is less than or equal to children.length. In that case, I would jump to that slide. Now, I therefore used some function called jump to slide handler, and I will need to define this. But before I continue with defining jump to slide handler, let's get done with the keyboard, and I'll add one last check, but before that, maybe it would be beneficial to add a return here. And afterward, if event.key code is equal to 48, that means I'm going to the 10th slide. I will check if I have 10 children. So if children.length is greater than or equal to 10, I will jump to slide 9. So I will use the jump to slide handler and go to slide 9. Still, jump to slide handler is not defined, as I said. So let's define it. And I'll do that here after the next slide handler. So I'll have const jump to slide handler, and it will take an ID, which is the slide that it will jump to. And I will use let to translate equal ID. And I will call translate full slides, which we defined previously, and I will pass to it to translate. And I will set my slider position to ID. Let's go to our carousel. If I press 1, it's taking me to the first slide, 2 would take me to the second, 3 to the fourth, 4, and this is 5, and this is 6. 6 is taking me to one which I don't want, because I have a boundary error here. And actually, if array pos is, I used here less than or equal to children.length, it should be less than children.length. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 won't do anything. And again, if I check here, I have 5 children. That's working right as expected. And again, pressing 2 would take me to the second slide right away. I haven't tested if 0 would take me to the 10th slide, so let's copy these a couple of times. Now I have 15 slides, and I'm getting too many warnings. Maybe I should consider adding the alt with an empty string, and I'll press 9, and this is the 8th. Again, let's have a look. This is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is the 9th, which has an index of 8, and 0 took me to the 10th. I noticed some wordiness here. Here I wrote let to translate equal ID, and then I'm sending this. We can do it right away without an additional variable. So this is ID, and it's still working as before. I also noticed when testing in Firefox that I have a scrollbar, an undesired scrollbar at the bottom, and I aim to remove that. So I'll modify my CSS, and here instead of auto, I'll change to hidden, and my scrollbar is not there anymore. I would like now to add some indicators at the bottom of my carousel. I want the zone under my display frame to have some buttons that would indicate where I am in the scrolling process. So under my container, I'm gonna add another div, a div that has a class name of classes.navigation. And inside this div, I'm gonna display my indicators. And for that, I'm gonna use a map, and I'm gonna therefore write them above the return. So I have my position indicators here. I'm gonna fill my position indicators here where I added my display items under them and before the useEffect. So here I'm gonna declare const position indicators, and I'm gonna use children.map as before, and I'm gonna take children with a small c and child index. And here I'm gonna display a div. This div will have a class name of position indicator, and in case it's the current slide, I will add current position to it. So my class name should typically be classes.positionIndicator, yet instead of assigning the name right away, I'm gonna do a small test. If slider position is equal to index, I'm gonna test for this. In that case, I'm gonna use classes.positionIndicators, and I'm gonna concatenate to it a space and classes.currentPosition. So it would take the class of position indicators, indicator without an S, and I'm gonna add to it classes.currentPosition. Otherwise, I'm gonna just use classes.positionIndicator. So these are my classes. I'm gonna use a position indicator, classes.positionIndicator, but if I'm at the current slide, at that slide, I'm gonna use position indicator in addition to current position. I have one thing that needs fixing here, and here I wrote position indicator with a small p. Let's change those to capital P and style our CSS. I'm gonna continue in my CSS and add a navigation class. I'm also gonna add a position indicator, and I'm also gonna add a current position. These are what I need for now. And these classes are empty, but I can see my carousel again, and let's continue working. I'm gonna set the width of this navigation class to 90%. Yet I want it to not flow outside of the frames width, and therefore I'm gonna give it this max width, which I calculated previously, which is 90 VH times 1.78. Again, this is the aspect ratio, 16:9. Justify content is center, and display, let's set it to flex. My margin is 0.5% auto, and again, not to see some blinking cursors or so on, I'm gonna set user select to none. Now, this might not be necessary in the way we did it right now. But in case you want to add some numbers to these indicators, you're gonna need that. Now, my position indicator, I'm gonna give it a box sizing of border box. I'm gonna give it a width of 2 VW and the height of 2 VW. In fact, I want it to be a circle, so these need to be the same. I'm also gonna give it a border of 1 pixel solid and AABBCC, a border radius of 50%, and a margin of 2 pixels, because I want something between them. I can relax now since I see my indicators at the bottom of the screen, but they're still dead. I wanna do some things with them. So I want to be able to click them. So I'm gonna add a hover, and when I hover over this, it will take some background color, which is CCDDEE. And we can see them when I hover, they're taking that background color. I'll also add an active, so active here, and the background in that case would be 206 EBD. So when I click on them, they will take a bluish color. I also want my current position to have a different border and a different background. So my border would be 1 pix solid 778899, and my background would be 99AABB. Apparently I can't see an active position. The active position should indicate which slide I'm at, and therefore I'll go back, inspect my carousel code, and I'll notice there's a typo here. This is current position, and maybe I'll just give it the color which I was already using. So that's my current position. And if I navigate using the keyboard or using these buttons, this is fine, this is working fine. Yet I want to be able to click on these and I have them take me to a slide that I want. And therefore, going back to my carousel.js, I will add under class name an onClick, and this onClick will use the jump to slide handler. So jump to slide handler, and I'll pass an index, the index of what I clicked here. Therefore, clicking on this would take me to the last slide. This one is taking me here. So the indicators are working and they make sense. However, if we inspect them on some portrait screen, this is a mobile view, they will be very small on a portrait screen. So I'm thinking that to use a different way of showing them when we're in portrait mode. So usually we're taking the width and accordingly sizing these indicators. However, in portrait mode, the height makes more sense. So I'll take the height instead. And therefore, at the end of my CSS file, I'm gonna add at media and max width of 600 pix. And I'll take that as an indicator that I'm in portrait. In that case, my position indicator, instead of using 2VW, it would use 2VH. So width would be 2VH and height would be 2VH as well. And therefore I have bigger indicators, and this is important for one thing. Usually when I'm on a portrait screen, I'm on a mobile device and I want these to be clickable. If they're too small, they won't be easy to click. Before we continue, let's add an alt prop to our images just so we get rid of these warnings, since we're gonna be using images a lot. So alt equals an empty string. But here these are just background images and they're meaningless for now. So I'm gonna keep the alt empty. Since I'm gonna move to working with the touch part and we'll be swiping regularly here, I need a lot of images. I added some links to images instead of using images in local storage, so you can download a smaller package. Of course, you can use images in your local storage if you prefer that. So this is my carousel right now, and I have much more images than before. They are a mix between portrait and landscape images. At this point, I want to work on enabling touch swipes, and touch swipes are different than mouse swipes, so these will have a part of their own. So let's go to carousel.js and see how we'll work there. To work with these, to be able to work with touch, I'm gonna work with events, therefore. I'm gonna add on touch start. So when a touch starts, I will do something. I'll also add an on touch end. So at the end of my swipe, after touching this, I will see if I swiped enough to move to another slide, or I swiped a little bit and I'd rather stay on my current slide. So I have an on-touch start and on-touch end, but I also want this to be responsive and I want it to follow my finger as I swipe. So in between, I'm gonna use on-touch move. So I'm gonna start my touch, I'm gonna move it, and then I'm gonna end it. So when I have an on-touch start, I'll take that event, E, and I will pass it to a handler, which I'll define, called touch start handler. On touch move, I'll also take that touch move and pass it to touch move handler. And for touch end, it's the same logic. I guess you guessed it, touch end handler. And here is my E. Staying in my carousel.js file, I want to add these handlers, and I'll add them before translate full slides, right after the key press handler. So I handled clicks, I handled the key press events, and now I'm gonna handle touch. So I'm gonna use const touch start handler, which will take E and take it from there. I'm gonna also use a const touch move handler, which will also take E and we'll take it from there. And I will use const touch end handler. Seems I have a typing mistake. Yeah, this is handler. So this is handler. These are right now. And let's start with touch start handler. I'm gonna be swiping in the X direction, and that's all I care about. I don't care about the Y direction. To be able to process my swipe and how much I swiped, I need to memorize where I started and where I'm ending. I'm gonna declare const touch start position and set touch start position. Again, I'm using useState here, and I'll initialize it to 0. Also for the touch end, I'm gonna use useState, and initially it's 0. So that's my touch start handler. And when my touch starts, I'm gonna set my touch start position to the location, to the X point where I tapped or where I touched. So I will use set touch start position and use E and pass to it E dot target touches 0 dot client X. And in fact, what if my touch ended at this point? So I will use, like I just tapped it, I will set my touch end position to that as well. So my touch started and ended at the same point for now. Now I want to tell my touch move handler that this was already touched, and therefore I'll need in my state touched. So I will use here set touched to true. And I'll add to my state using useState const touched set touched, and I will use state and pass to it false. So initially it's not touched. Before proceeding, I'll also need a swipe, and we'll see that in a bit. So I'll use here set swipe, and initially it's not swiped, so this is useState false. For my touch move handler, every time I move, I'm changing my end position, the position where my finger ends. So I will set touch end position to E.target touches index 0 client X. Again, we don't care about the Y, we're just projecting on the X axis. I'm also gonna need to process my swipes. I'm gonna need the width of this display frame. So for my display frame, I'm gonna add an ID so I can get it later on. And this is ID equals display frame. And back to my handler, to my touch move handler. I'm gonna write a handler to translate slides, just like I wrote this one to translate full slides. So I'm gonna write one to translate partial slides, and I'm gonna pass to this, to the translate partial slides, I'm gonna pass to it a percentage. I wanna pass a percentage to my function which will translate partial slides. So here I translated full slides, and I'm gonna use another one to translate partial slides, and it will take some percentage of movement just like this one took. So this one took the new position, it calculated to translate, and then it's translating things in means of a percentage. So therefore I'm translating some fraction of my display frame width. I'll therefore need to know that width. So const frame width, and for my frame width I can declare it outside the touch move handler, but actually it's not a big deal here, and since the frame width might change on resize, on rotating screens and so on, I'd rather keep it like this. So this is document get element by ID, and I'm gonna get my display frame and offset width. Now I have the width of my display frame, and I want to process the move as a fraction of how much I moved. So we'll use translate dist, and it's equal to the touch end position, so where my touch is ending, minus the touch start position. And again, I want it as a fraction, so I'm gonna divide that by the frame width, and at the end I'm gonna pass it as some form, some percentage. So I'm gonna multiply by 100, and I will call translate partial slides and pass that translate this to it. And since my touch moved now, I wanna also set this to swiped, since my touch end handler will depend on swiped at the end. Therefore, I will use if touched equals true, then set swiped to true. Before dealing with the swiped and going to the touch end handler, let's use the translate partial slides. Let's write the translate partial slides. I'm gonna pass to it to translate. Now I wanna know how much I already translated previously, since I might not be at the initial slide. I might be here in the middle. I might not be at the initial slide, so I wanna know where I am to know how much I wanna translate additionally. So again, here we'll use let current translation, and how much did I translate previously? It's my slider position, but I'm going in the other direction, therefore negative, minus slider position times width span. And let's let the total translation, where I wanna go, it's equal to current translation, and I'm gonna add to it to translate. Again, what we're doing here would account for positive and negative, since my touch end position will be either greater or less than my touch start position. So that's my total translation, and I'm gonna translate everything in my carousel, all the children, everything in my film, and I'm gonna translate it by that total translation. So for var I equals 0, I less than children dot length, I plus plus, so these are all my elements. I'm gonna let element, and I'm gonna use document.get element by ID here, document. I'm gonna get that, which is carousel item plus I. So I'm gonna get carousel item 0, carousel item 1, etc. And I'm gonna transform these elements by translate x. Again, let's add a backtick here. Plus total translation plus percentage, and close the brackets. I'm getting every slide, every child, and moving it to total translation. I'm doing that while also accounting for where I am. So I'm taking my current translation where I already am. So I'm at slide 5, and I'm moving a quarter of a slide afterward, which is the to translate. This will account to total translation. So let's see what happens here, and for that I'm gonna switch to mobile view, enable touch simulation, Let's save this. And we can see it's following my swipe. Now, it's a bit slow. We'll see how to deal with it. But at the end of my touch, things are staying in the middle. My touch ended and things are staying there. I want it to complete my swipe for me. So when my touch ends, it will think, will I need to translate to the previous slide, to the next slide, or stay where I am? The touch move might be triggered for some reason, and that's why I used the touch before it. So if I didn't have a touch start, I won't have the touched, and if I didn't have a touch moved, I won't have the swipe. So I will check for swipe. So if swipe is not there, if I didn't swipe, I will not do anything in my touch end handler. So if swiped, I will check the difference between the start position and the end position. And let's say I want to swipe 75 pixels to consider it a swipe. Therefore, I will find the difference between touch start position and touch end position. If this is greater than 75, then I'm swiping next, so I will call next slide handler. Otherwise, I would have either done a small swipe, which is not counted as a swipe, or I would have swiped in the other direction, so I will use an else if and check if my touch start position minus touch end position is less than minus 75. In that case, I'm gonna use the previous slide handler. Otherwise, I did a small swipe, probably by mistake, so I would jump to the slide which I'm currently in, just so that I go to the beginning of that slide. So jump to slide handler, and I'm gonna use slider position. Now, my swipe ended here, therefore I will set touched to false and set swiped to false. Let's refresh, and I'm here in the middle, I'm swiping and it's continuing. I'll do a small swipe and we can see it dragged it a bit, but then it went to the position, to the initial position of that slide. And if I swipe in the other direction, it processed it. But while I'm swiping, I want it to be more snappy, and my animation here in CSS is set to 500 ms. And if I slow that to 50 ms, it's more snappy, but at the end of it, at the end of my swipe, it's going very fast, and I don't want that. I want it to stay as it is before, but I'll deal with it in another way. I will speed up the animation when I'm using touch, and then as my touch ends, I will slow down that animation. So I'll keep this at 500 milliseconds instead of 50, just like it was before. Maybe I'll change this to ease out, so my animation would slow toward the end. And that's it. Okay, and I just need to deal with this snappiness as I swipe. Therefore, I'll add a class in CSS. I'll add a class which would speed up the animation, and I will add this class to my slides as I swipe and remove it at the end of my swipe. So after carousel item, I'm gonna add fast animation, and in this one I'm gonna set my transition to 50 milliseconds linear. So instead of having 500 milliseconds for the animation or the transition to complete, it would be only 50 milliseconds. I can go to 10, that would be even snappier, but it would cause a problem on low-end devices. 50 is a good compromise. Now I have this class, but I wanna append it to the things that I'm swiping as I touch. So back to Carousel.js, and on touch start handler, I'm gonna speed my animation before dealing with the position. So I'm gonna speed animation, and I'll write that function in a few seconds. And when my touch ends, I'm gonna slow the animation. Here, if swiped, then I'll slow animation. And if it wasn't swiped, there's nothing that would speed the animation. Let's call it speed up, so it's more clear. Speed up animation and slow down animation. I'll write these just above my touch handlers. So const speed up animation. And for that, I'll take all the elements from I equals 0 till I is less than children dot length I plus, and I'm gonna get these elements. I'm gonna get every slide, every child. So let lm equals document.get element by ID carousel item plus I. So now I have element, and I'm gonna speed it up. So lm.classList.add, I'm gonna add that class. I'm gonna add the fast animation to it. Classes.fast animation with a capital F. And at the end, I'm gonna slow these down. So const slow animation for let I equals 0, I less than children dot length I plus, and I let lm equals document.get element by ID just as above. And I'm gonna remove that class. So lm.classList.remove classes.fast animation. So I'm adding this class. This is slow down animation. I'm adding this class when I start my swipe, and I'm removing it at the end. And we can see they are more snappy right now. Things are more snappy, and as I release my touch, as I release my swipe, they are slowing down. This does the trick. And let's see, I have infinite turned on. If I scroll at the extremities, it's going to the other direction, and it's taking 500 milliseconds. Now we sped up the animation and we slowed it down, and we did that for all of our slides, all the children of the carousel. But in fact, when I swipe, I'm seeing the next one and the previous one only. And therefore, I don't need to speed everything up. I can speed up only this slide, the previous, and the next. Now this is a very good implementation, but it's O of n, and it ensures that everything works smoothly, but we might want to reduce the complexity from O of n to O of 1. It would be enough to speed up the current slide, the previous, and the other one. And just to be on the safe side, I will add 2 additional slides to the left and the right. So dealing with this, I would, instead of doing all of these, I would let I equals slider position -2 till I is less than slider position +3, which is slider position +2 in that case, and I++. But what if I'm at the extremity? What if I'm at slide 0? That would try to get carousel item -2 and my app would crash. Therefore, I will use math.max 0 and slider position -2. So if I can't go below 0, I would stop at 0, and the same applies here. I will here use the minimum, so math.min of children.length and slider position +3. This would apply for the second for loop in the slowdown animation. So I'll copy it here. And again, I'm simulating touch here, not a mouse drag. And these are my swipes. And at the extremity, we can see it's somehow elastic. You can add some image to imply elasticity here, but I think this is very simple the way it is. And it would go to the other side. We can also see our state updating accordingly. This is a neglected swipe. This one is staying here. If I do a full swipe, this one is moving. And that's why I separated the next slide and previous slide handlers alone. So I don't have to deal with this on every event, whether it's a key press event, a button click, or a swipe. So far, I was able to swipe using touch and have a responsive carousel for touch. We can see it here, and we saw it on mobile as well. But as soon as I disable touch input and revert back to a normal mouse, I won't be able to swipe. The same is in Chrome. In mobile view, I can swipe easily when I have touch enabled, and then when I go back to a normal view, I can't drag these. So I'm gonna work now on mouse swipes or drags, and therefore I'm gonna use a similar logic to what I used for touch. So just like I have touch events, I have mouse events, and I'm gonna start by declaring their state right away. So const, I will have a mouse start position, just like I have a touch start position, I have a mouse start position. I also have a mouse end position. Just like I used touched and swiped, I will have now mouse clicked. So this is mouse clicked, and I will have mouse swipe, or it can be mouse drag, and I'm using use state, so I'm gonna complete them just like above. Now that I filled these and I have the state ready for that, I'll move to the mouse event handlers. And I'll write those right below the touch handlers. So I'll start with const mouse start handler, and it's gonna take an event. I will speed the animation just like what I did before, so I'm gonna use speed up animation, and then I'm gonna set the mouse start position just like what I did before, so set mouse start position to e.clientx and set mouse end position. It's the same at the moment. and I will set mouse clicked to true. Actually, these are wrong. This is mouse end position. So it's the same as the start position initially when I click. And I will set mouse clicked equals true. Now that's important for the next handler, which is mouse move handler. And here I'm gonna take an E, and I will do as before. I will take the frame width, and I can actually split this into its own part, but it's just a few lines. I don't want to make much calls. And I'm gonna take the width of my frame, and then I wanna check if the mouse is clicked. So if mouse clicked, again, we don't have to put this part. This is just for clarity. So if mouse clicked, I will set my mouse end position to e.clientX, and I will calculate the translate distance, and it's a fraction with respect to the frame width, so it's mouse end position minus mouse start position. I'll divide it by the frame width and make it a percentage, and as I did before, I'll translate partial slides, translate this, and I will set the mouse swipe to true. So now I know that I started a swipe as well. Now I'm gonna disable this if just for a second. Before I continue, let's add these touch events here, or mouse events actually. So just like I have on touch start, I'll have on mouse start, or actually it's not on mouse start, it's on mouse down. So on mouse down, I'll have an E, which is passed to mouse start handler as well. I will also have on mouse move, which is when I move my mouse, and it's mouse move handler. And on mouse up, which is when I released my click, and again E, and this is mouse end handler. So just like I did for the touch, I'm doing these here, and I'll have a const mouse end handler, and for the moment I will not fill it. Now you can see I disabled the if here on purpose, and that's why we need to check for the mouse if it's clicked. It's following my mouse even if I don't click. So I clicked here, then as my mouse entered the frame, it's moving without me clicking. That's why I need to check if my mouse is clicked before proceeding with the rest. So again, this won't move now, but when I click and swipe, it will move. But I'm seeing some weird behavior because my mouse end handler isn't there yet. When I release my click, just like when I released my touch, I wanna slow down my animation, so I don't want that snappiness that I had. And I'll check if the mouse is swiped. So if mouse swiped, again this is optional, if equals true. And I'll do the same logic as before. So if mouse start position minus mouse end position, and instead of 75, I'll go with 100, since usually on a computer we tend to swipe more with the mouse, not like touch screens. So I'll use this as 100, and in that case it's next slide handler. Otherwise, if I swipe 100 pixels in the other direction, it's previous slide handler. So that's mouse start position, not handler. And this is my mouse end position again. If it's less than minus 100, I will use the previous slide handler. And otherwise, I will use jump to slide handler and to the slide that I'm initially on. It means I didn't swipe enough to move to another slide. I just need to return to the beginning of this slide, so to slider position, which is in my state. At the end of this, I will set mouse clicked to false. Otherwise, if I don't do that, this mouse move handler will kick in every time I move my mouse, even without me clicking. So I set mouse swipe to false, and I need to set mouse click to false as well. Apparently, everything here makes sense. I'm setting the mouse click to false, I'm setting the mouse swipe to false, but the behavior here still doesn't make sense. Even here, it's not making sense when I release. And basically, we need to prevent the defaults to make things reasonable again, to get the desired behavior. So here I'll use e.prevent default, and here I'll use e.prevent default. Now I'll swipe, and that's very natural. That's here in Chrome, and that's in Firefox, in mobile view, and even if I quit the mobile view, I'm back in my carousel. I'm viewing it full width, and I'll notice one inconvenience, which is when I drag, if my mouse leaves this display frame and I happen to release my button there, it will still follow my mouse even though I'm not clicking the button. So I need to handle what happens when the mouse exits this point, these boundaries. And this can be solved with ease. We already have a mouse end handler, so we just need to add here on mouse exit, or actually it's on mouse leave. So on mouse leave, I will just use the mouse end handler as before. So if the mouse leaves the designated area, its designated area, I will use the mouse end handler as well. And now going back here, as soon as I exit this point, it will process the swipe. And again, in Firefox, when I leave this point, it will use the mouse end, and depending on the distance of the swipe, it will decide to jump slides or not. Our carousel is almost done. It's fully functional and we can work with it. It reaches the end and scrolls. It's mouse draggable. The buttons here are working. They are clickable. The keyboard buttons, the keyboard navigation is functional. We can add a few bonus features, let's say, and I'll add a timer with the ability to auto advance even if I change things manually. So even if I drag or click a button, it would keep advancing. And I will also add the ability to stop that timer when someone puts a manual input. Therefore, I will need to pass two props for this to work. My component will take, therefore, a prop called timer and another prop called stop on manual. So I will add these two props, which I can pass to my carousel. And here I can pass a timer, which is equal, let's say, to 5000 milliseconds, and stop on manual. Now I'll take care of the first feature, which is the timer by itself, so I won't pass the stop on manual, and I'll set a shorter duration just so we can observe it. And let's go ahead and implement this. I want to set my timer with my component. So when my component mounts, I want to put this timer, I want to run this timer, and therefore I will use the useEffect, since the useEffect is the equivalent of the component will mount or component will update, and every time the component mounts or updates, this useEffect will be there. So in addition to adding this key press handler, I'll deal with my timer in useEffect, and I will check if there is a timer, which is therefore a timer that's not equal to undefined. And in that case, I will have a variable called interval, and I'm not gonna declare it here, even though that's gonna cause a warning. We'll get to that in a minute. So here I'll let interval be a set interval, and in this set interval I will call the next slide handler, and the duration of this interval is the value that I passed through timer. Therefore, the value that I will pass when I write the component here, which is either 5000, 2000, whatever it is. So therefore, I still need to declare interval, and I will add interval here after my props, so I will type let interval. I forgot to add these parentheses here for next slide handler. Now also in the return, since I added an interval here, I need to clear my interval. So I will clear this interval. Now going here, I can see that it's auto-advancing, but when I add some input, things are becoming unpredictable. It might auto-advance while the timer is set. The timer might trigger while I'm auto-advancing, and so on. This might cause some unpredicted behavior, and therefore I'll need to handle my timer in a somehow different way. Not to have things advance while I'm dragging, as we saw here. I don't want things to advance while I'm dragging. I'm gonna handle the timer differently, and I will add a manage timer function for that purpose. So right here before the click handlers, I will add const manage timer. In this manage timer, I'm gonna clear my interval, which is interval. So this is supposed to stop my timer. I need to call manage timer on different events. Manage timer, in addition to clearing the interval to prevent auto-advancing while I'm changing, it will also prevent those advances where you advance, it finishes, and the timer triggers again. So, you know, you might wait for 5 seconds, the timer is 5 seconds, you'll wait for 4 seconds and change, then after 1 second it will change again by itself. So this will avoid it. And I'll start with adding the manage timer in the next click and previous click handlers, just so we can see what's happening. manage timer is here, and manage timer is here. And let's put a longer timer just so we can observe it. Let's go for 5,000. I changed just before 5 seconds, and now this waited 5 seconds again. So it didn't trigger after 1 second. That's what manage timer is doing at the moment. Yet, one more interesting thing here is that the timer is resuming. Why is it resuming even though we stopped it? The thing is, useEffect is kicking in every time our component updates, and my component is updating when my state changes, and therefore this interval is being set again when my state changes. So therefore, after the slider position changes, useEffect will be put into action again. My timer will be there again. Now let's add this manage timer to our handlers. I will add it to my key press handler. So when I press the keys, I'll be managing my timer. And there's more important than the timing. There's one thing more important than the timing here, which is stopping the timer if we want to stop it on manual input. There's also the touch start handler. The touch start handler should manage my timer when I start a touch, and my mouse start handler should manage the timer as well. So these are managing the timer. Now at this point I'm ready to add another thing, which is the stop on manual. I can pass here stop on manual, and let's see how we're gonna manage this. I will add something to my state called auto advance. So in my state I will memorize auto advance. So const auto advance, and I will set auto advance as well. And I will use useState definitely for this. And my initial state would be that timer is not equal to undefined. So auto advance would be true if my timer is not undefined. If my timer is defined, whenever I define a timer, auto advanced will be true. That's my initial state. Otherwise, if I haven't defined a timer, my initial state would be false. I need to change the way in which manage timer works. So I'm gonna keep the clear interval, but I will check if stop on manual is there. So if stop on manual, I will set auto advance to false, and therefore auto advance will not be there. And here in my useEffect, instead of checking for the timer if it's not equal to undefined, I can check for auto advance. So after adding auto advance here, I'm getting an error. This isn't loading, and the problem is that I can't use timer before initialization, and that's easy to solve. I'll just move this line to here after timer is initialized, and the problem is solved. And now it's auto advancing, and I'll see how to manage the rest. One thing here, when auto advance is true, when it's set to true, it means timer is not equal to undefined anyway. So I can remove this. And things are advancing as predicted. Now I want to check if stop on manual is working, and I'll use a shorter timer interval here. So every 2 seconds I'm advancing, and when I click this, apparently it stopped. It's not advancing anymore. Let's check, is it working with other things? Is it working with the keyboard? Yes, it's working with the keyboard. Is it working with mouse swipes, mouse drags? Yes, it stopped. It's not advancing anymore. Okay, that makes sense. We can also verify that it's working with swipes. If we go to mobile view, and that's a swipe, and it's not advancing anymore. We can also add console logs to verify this. So till now, useEffect is doing as we want, but we might find one more inconvenience. One detail or inconvenience that we might encounter here is when we remove stop on manual. So our timer is still working, but we wanna restart it as we did before after every manual input, so that we don't have two actions taking place right after each other, one manual and one right after the timer triggers. And so therefore, I'll show you what I mean. While I swipe this, the timer is set and this auto advanced by itself, and as soon as I move my mouse, things will jump into the middle, and I don't want that. I want to stop these things when I'm working with manual input. And if it's a click or a key press, it's not a big deal. It's gonna take a fraction of a second, and we already took care of that in manage timer. And we can see here that manage timer is clearing the interval after these inputs, after the click handler or the key press handler. It's also being called here in the touch start handler, but okay, it's managing the timer at the start of the touch or the start of the mouse drag, but afterward it's not managing it. So as the mouse is moving, even if I add manage timer, but if I hold still, the timer will reset. And therefore, that's not a good way of doing it. I want, as soon as I start a drag action or a swipe action, to stop my timer. And therefore, one thing that I can think of is to modify this to account for that. But there's an easier way to do it. In fact, I'm memorizing in my state if my mouse is clicked and if the screen is touched. I have touched and I have mouse clicked. And I can add these here to useEffect. So in useEffect, I'm checking for auto advance. If auto advance is true, then I would put the timer on. But I can also add another check. So auto advance should be true. And at the same time, I want that clicked is not true. Mouse clicked is not true. So not mouse clicked. And at the same time, I want not touched. So if my mouse clicked or my touched are set to true, then I'm in the middle of an action, of a long action, and I won't set the timer. One might wonder that I added these conditions here, then my timer would stay stopped. But in fact, these functions are unsetting mouse clicked and touched when the action ends. So mouse end handler is resetting this to false, and this will update as soon as my state changes. Therefore, my timer will be set again. Now I have a warning here that is related to interval, but I purposely set interval outside of the useEffect. I know it's gonna be lost after each render, and in fact, I'm taking advantage of that. I have an interesting boundary condition test case, edge case, where I have one child, and we already saw some potential problems that this might cause when we used the React children here. We did that to avoid problems with one child, because children.length won't be 1. In fact, it's gonna be undefined since I don't have an array. One child won't result in an array afterward. So I have one slide, and if I click on the next slide to go to the next slide, things are fine. This state is still shown here. If I go to the previous slide, this is lost. There's an interesting reason why this is lost when I click on previous, but not on next. So no matter how many times I click on next, it's there. In fact, when I go here to my next slide handler, this is my next slide handler. I'm checking if infinite is there, which is my case here. If infinite is there, I'm setting my new position to 0, everything's fine. But in the previous slide handler, I'm not setting it to 0. I'm setting it to children.length, which is undefined. And therefore, instead of setting it to children.length every time, if children.length is there, I'll proceed as usual. Otherwise, I'll set it to 0. Now, if I click on next or I click on previous, my state shows 0. This is fine. This is, though, not draggable. I can't drag it with my mouse. And in mobile view, I can't swipe it. So let's work on this. And we have to work with translate partial slides. So this is partial. And this is it. I'm going from I equals 0 till I is less than children.length, which is undefined as well. So instead of leaving this alone, I'll add less than 1 as an OR. So if I can't obtain children.length, my fallback would be 1. And therefore things are starting to translate. I can see some errors here, and it's still laggy. Let's fix the lag before going with the rest. And the lag is because I can't speed up things, because again, when I go to speed up animation, I'm going from I equals math.max 0 slider position -2, and here it's math.min, and I have this as an undefined. So since I have an undefined here, I also need a fallback, so it's either less than math.min, these, and if it's undefined, I will fall back to 1, and I will apply the same thing here in the slowdown animation. If it's undefined, I will fall back to 1. Let's see how it acts. Okay, this is snappy, but things are staying in the middle because, again, I need to fix the translate full slides. So full slides, and in full slides, again, I need a fallback, which is 1. Let's refresh. That's going, and I still have something wrong at translate partial slides. I need a parenthesis here. And here again, let's add them that way. Now, this is snappy, and when I release my click, it will go back slowly to where it should be. If I try it with swipes again, and I can see the indicator here working properly. By the end of this tutorial, we got exposed to various aspects of React. We laid out our component, handled actions on it, animated it, and so on. We made use of the state and different tools that React offers. The code you saw here can be optimized a bit further. I'll keep that for another video, so stay tuned.